I would just say that, unlike many people who have written on this subject, most people, to my knowledge, I am not. Don't come to it as an activist. I don't come to it as a philosopher or journalist. I really came to it as someone who had instincts about it since I was a kid, which I don't think distinguishes me from most people, and as a new father who had to, like all new parents do, make food decisions on his child's behalf. So I'm very, very pleased to be here with Louisa, who has thought about these things in a professional context and is probably armed with enough information to dwarf what I have. But I think what I hope to bring to tonight and to this is a way of thinking about this as a story, because inevitably I think our food choices depend on the stories that we tell ourselves and how we accept or reject the stories that are told to us.
I lived for a long time in a country that will appeal to you, which was then Zaire, the Congo. I also lived in Papua New Guinea, and those years, nearly 10 years all in all, were years of acute food shortage. So I actually experienced that, which I really didn't know about as a child, but I experienced it as an adult. I also spent 10 years of my life in Italy, which made me discover the beauty of actually this local, small-scale, long Mediterranean tradition, and I started to learn a lot more about cooking. When I went to university, when I was 17, to Wageningen University, which is an agriculture faculty, I decided to become a vegetarian because at that time our first calculations just suggested that it was just not a serious option to eat meat, and I thought I should practice what I preach. However, over time, I've understood far more about the animal issue in relation with, for example, environment. I was the head of the group that did the first calculations at FAO at the time about the climate issue in relation to food and meat. So I have understood that the issue is far more complex than just me saying I don't want to eat meat. And I hope we can have some of that nuance in the debate tonight.
And in the case of smoking, at a certain stage, the government stepped in with rules, making it harder to sell to youngsters or putting these warning messages. Is that what you hope it will develop into as well?
I hope so. I don't expect it to happen anytime soon. I mean, we don't need the option of buying toys coated in lead paint. And we might not need the option of buying, Chilean sea bass. We don't need all of the options that we presently have, and we shouldn't have them all. And it cannot be a consumer's responsibility to parse all the information or to be expected to know it. So, it's nice to imagine legislation that actually limits our choices and regulates. I mean, there are an awful lot of laws on the books now that aren't in any way being enforced, particularly when it comes to, and this is a parallel issue, but to animal welfare in animal agriculture. It's almost entirely unmonitored, even though there are regulations on the books.
I became a vegetarian when I was 17 or 18. I actually am somewhat more nuanced today than I was then. Of course, one has to be rigid and idealistic when one is 18. But for example, if I'm in Africa and people in the village kill one of their last chickens, I'm not going to say, oh no, thank you. I mean, there is also something in offering meat, which is very much part of a cultural tradition of hospitality in many parts of the world. And to be too rigid on this would actually cut off a lot of cultural traditions which have their place in many parts of the world. So I agree very much with Jonathan. It's very much about how do we do things today, and not just about an end product in black and white. And actually this applies to a lot of things. Actually, I think the whole meat or fish issue is also the tip of the iceberg in terms of our entire consumption pattern. And it's really only when we start to talk about our consumption patterns and about the surplus society in which we live, that we really hit the economic basis of our own behaviors.
I think that a complete withdrawal from factory farm animal products is a good idea, it does leave alternative meat sources, of which there are some. I went to, people ask me often what were the most shocking things you learned in your research. Frankly, one of the most shocking things I saw was how good some of the good farms were that I went to, some of the small and family farms. That was something I wasn't anticipating and had a very hard time finding objections to. And to be frank, I went in wanting to object to them. And they changed my argument. So there are alternative meat sources. The other reality is people aren't going to wake up tomorrow and stop eating factory farmed animal products. So, if what we ultimately care about is, lessening the amount of violence that's done to animals, creating a more, sustainable, reasonable food supply in terms of the environment, and also, getting as many antibiotics out of the food system as possible, making it as safe for human health as possible, then my attitude has been to do it incrementally. I think this absolutist position just doesn't work. It hasn't worked. I don't see how it would work. But I think if you approach people with this and say, you can hold in your mind these two ideas at the same time. This is really terrible, and I'm going to continue to do it. Obviously, people can hold those two ideas in their mind. So I think there's much more success in encouraging people to do less, to consume less.
On the one hand, we are nostalgic for a kind of farming past of small-scale production and small-scale animal rearing and caring for cows and what have you, and a personal relationship to nature of farmers. But those same people who like that and publicity to advertising is very much playing to that image. The same consumers also want to have cheap food, and cheap food per definition means factory food. And people are able to be extremely inconsistent there. That's why in my last book on this, called in Dutch Nieuwe Spijswetten, New Food Laws, I really argue for a new kind of awareness, more than just saying do's and don'ts, because I don't think do's and don'ts will help to change the attitudes. It's too easy for people to hide behind the do's and don'ts. It's really about a new awareness. And that's why I took up this idea of the old food laws, including, of course, the Jewish kashrut laws, but many cultures have food laws, which we have missed now because this secularization, we've lost the religious tradition. But as I will argue tonight, I mean, the Catholic Church had 166 days of fasting a year in the Middle Ages. And we don't have that, and we now only have a government that looks at the minimum quality of our food, but there's no authority apart from the individual that tells you what to do. And it's too difficult for the individual to really be consistent. So that's why we have these inconsistencies, I think.
I mean, there was a movement in Chicago to have 1 day a week vegetarian school lunches in public schools, and people just, you'd think they were taking away textbooks. People got so up in arms. It was considered the most radical, unconstitutional.
Freedom of expression.
Yeah, freedom of expression, exactly.
I wanted to argue against the simplistic sort of back to nature kind of attitude, because we are not going to feed the world if we have very small scale operations only. And the main demand for food, of course, is not at all in the US and Europe, it's in Asia, particularly in China. So the question is, what can we do to improve the techniques that they're using there with the insight we have now, and still be able to feed people? Because there is, whether you like it or not, an enormous demand for animal proteins. There's also a real undernutrition that we have to cater for. Now, what you would like to happen is that they don't lapse into the same mistakes that we've made. And in fact, in other areas, like in the chemical industry, you see they are learning very, very much from our processes. So in a dialogue with the Chinese, we can look at what is best, what are the best ways of doing it, keeping in mind that everywhere the urban population will even go up to about perhaps as high as 65–70%. So you need a system that is efficient in terms of human labor. I think there are ways of improving our animal production system while still meeting, or our food system in general, while still meeting some of the serious concerns we have about the environment as Jonathan also says, on the virology side, for example, and the animal welfare issue. And I think actually, I'm in that sense, I'm an optimist, having just come back from China, for example. I think the Chinese are learning very fast.
The technologies could be offset by the habits changing to imitate American eating habits?
Oh, I don't think they would define it ever as imitating American eating habits.
Well, to start eating in ways that are more closely, maybe not imitating us, but consuming as much animal protein as we do.
I really would bet my money on the fact that the Chinese will never reach American protein consumption levels.
Let's hope so.